Okay, everybody. So thank you very much for coming, first of all, especially on Friday the 13th. So especially, I know a lot of people have just finished your marking or perhaps not even started your marking. Really do appreciate you taking the time and making the effort to come here. Hopefully it will be a useful experience for all of us. So this is our Widening Participation with Lecture Recording Collaborative Cluster as part of QAA Scotland's Enhancement Themes programme. So this enhancement theme is under supporting students and using evidence to do that. So we're really interested in the kind of evidence that we all have in our various institutions about how we support students, particularly with widening participation in mind, and whether or not we're doing that with lecture recording, the kind of policies that we're implementing or not implementing, as the case may be. I just want to point out that we are recording today's session. What we're going to do, when the recording is on, you will see a red light on this pedestal, dial. The recording, I believe, is just of the slides and our voices. I can't see the camera, but that doesn't mean it's not here. I'm afraid I'm not terribly used to this room. We are not going to be recording discussions. So what we'll do is we'll pause the recordings. I will hit this button that we have open discussions about what we're doing in our respective institutions, and that's why I think it's very important that we are free to have those discussions without the recordings taking place. If at any point you feel uncomfortable with the recording, you want it to be paused, please do ask. We can do that very easily. It's just hitting the button. Is that clear with everybody? Okay, I'm going to batter on because we do have a bit of a packed schedule. First off, I'm going to introduce the team. Myself, we have Emily Nordman from the University of Glasgow and Jacqui Hutchison from the University of Aberdeen. And then we'll do some introductions around the tables as well, because we have some people from very far-flung places. But I'm Jill Mackay. I am a lecturer in veterinary science at the Royal Dutch School of Veterinary Studies. I'm really interested in digital education and how digital environments can help or hinder students to learn. I'm also quite interested mainly just in research methods and how do we find evidence, and that's how I kind of got suckered into the QA evidence for enhancement themes, because I'm really interested in what counts as evidence. I like qualitative evidence, I like quantitative evidence, and I like using both of them together. We also have with us, I'll give you my mic over.
Thank you. So I'm Jacqui Hutchison. I'm from Aberdeen University. My interest is in widening access, so widening participation, bit of a passion of mine, which is how I came into the project. Emily Nordman, who I took over from in psychology in Aberdeen, knew my sort of my background and my feelings about it and asked me to be involved in the project. Much of the research I take part in involves stereotype formation and maintenance, which actually fits really nicely with widening participation. And it's about trying to understand attitudes and behaviours and how that might impact students' experiences when they come into higher education, and how they can access the information in a variety of different ways. So that's really where my passion and my interest in this project comes in. I'm also interested in how people perceive and process the information. So it all fits really nicely with the whole QA cluster and the widening participation aspect of it. So I'll now hand you over to Emily.
Hello, so I am a lecturer in the School of Psychology at the University of Glasgow. I've been at Glasgow for just over a year now. I was at Aberdeen and have left it in good hands. So my pedagogical research interests are about lecture capture. So I've been doing research on lecture capture for a few years now, and I'm particularly interested in the relationship between how students use lecture recordings and their other study behaviours, because the conversation about lecture capture quite frequently focuses on attendance and this kind of very blunt binary, is it good or bad? And I think it's a tool that can be used either poorly or well, and that is related to a whole heap of other things. My PhD was on psycholinguistics. My subject research is figurative language, so I do stuff on, it was idiomatic language, and now I do research on swearing. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag in terms of my interests, but I know, obviously I know Jacqui from Aberdeen, and I know Jill from Twitter, because social media is amazing. And yeah, that's me.
I don't know, Lee, would you like to wave a hand? So we also have Lee Murray, who is our research assistant. Lee is going to be dealing with Twitter today, just on that social media note. One of the big aspects of this cluster that I think is going to be really important is that it doesn't just happen within these meetings. We are hosting a meeting here in Edinburgh. We're going to host a meeting in Aberdeen in the new year and a meeting in Glasgow a little bit later on. But these are really points for the whole sector to come together to talk. We expect these conversations to continue happening outside of the meetings. I think that's the only way that this cluster is actually going to be able to really create the impact. I think we kind of see ourselves as administrators of you guys, and we're hoping that through the discussions that happen in the rooms and outside of the rooms over the course of the next 6 months, then we can bring those together and sort of feed them back to the sector. So we really are trying to make this a collaborative cluster. So our aims for the cluster, we said when we started that what we wanted to do was develop best practice guidelines to support widening participation students. I tried to say work placement students there, just to show you how important it is that we mainstream the use of widening participation. With lecture capture through collating evidence, sharing of best practice, student partnerships, I think are very important. We have quite a lot of student participants in the room from various student unions, which is really exciting. One of the things that I think we have all sort of said, and I hope you would agree, if we can have student representation at each of the meetings, it will make these conversations a lot more productive. That's definitely something that we've experienced at Edinburgh when we've been doing our evaluations of lecture recording. When we have both staff and students in the same room, those conversations are a lot more fruitful than when it's just staff that are saying, ah, well, students do this and students do that. Because the student voice is so important in all of these discussions. And in terms of outputs, we think it would be really good to produce some resources which can support the sector, particularly for schools and for teachers. So supporting transitions and helping schools to support transitions into university. For resources for widening participation students, perhaps resources about how to study better, how to use lectures, how to prepare yourself for university. Resources for widening participation teams, what kind of policies are available, what policies are working well, what policies maybe aren't working so well, being able to share good practice across the sector, and basically just resources for anyone who thinks that those might be useful to them. That's what we've kind of scoped out as this would be useful, but like I said, this is really you guys in the room to do the work, so if you're sitting there with an amazingly bright idea, we really want to hear about it. Sorry, I'm checking my agenda here. We do want to talk about widening participation and lecture capture, but I also think we've kind of spoken enough at the moment. It would be nice to go around the room and kind of get to know who is here. I'm going to pause the recording for this bit.
Okay, so I just thought I'd talk very briefly about why we thought to pair widening participation with lecture capture. So there is actually quite a large body of research conducted on lecture capture. I think it's possibly focused on, the issue of attendance a little bit too much, but there is a huge body there. People sometimes don't like the conclusions that the research comes to, but it is there. And what we know so far is that there are benefits of providing lecture recordings for particular groups of students. So there's kind of a general benefit, if you miss a lecture, you can catch up. I've done work that found that our non-native speakers in first year used the recordings significantly more in the first semester of first year, and then there was no differences in second, third and fourth year students. So you can see they're actually using it, and that comes out very much in our student evaluations, that the non-native speakers, particularly when they first come to university, really appreciate it. There's some work done, Anna Wood, was it Edinburgh, yeah? It was qualitative, I think, where the students reported that the provision of lecture recordings really helped reduce their anxiety about note-taking. And it's this weird paradox, because when you provide lecture recordings, one thing that academics will sometimes worry about is that it will reduce study skills. That because there's a recording there, they've always got something to go back to. And actually, I have the complete opposite view, is that I think because you're not required to write down everything word for word, it can actually promote better note-taking skills. It's not good note-taking to write down verbatim what someone's saying. You summarise as you go, and it helps learning. And if you do that, but there's a plan B, if it doesn't work, you know, that's really helpful. And the students pick up on this. There's also, from Jill's work, students with caring responsibilities really appreciate the provision of lecture recording. What happens if your child is sick or, you know, something happens at home? You can catch up. Students as well with learning adjustments. You know, there's so many different ways that students can be affected by different, you know, needs, and then add in the note-taking and second language, and this all stacks up that we know that this really helps. And then finally, we've been looking at improving study skills and strategies, and there's a paper that hopefully might just be about to get published on recommendations for students and lecturers. And the idea of the paper and the guidance that we've produced is to try and embed the use of lecture recordings in study skills more generally. So it's not just about lecture recordings, it's about how do you build it in with note-taking and revision and all of this stuff. So don't think of it as this thing on its own. If you think of it as this discrete thing, it won't work. It has to be built in. We know all of that. There's still work to be done, but as yet that we're aware of, and we've done some digging, I can't find a single paper that's looked at lecture recordings and widening participation students, and that's despite the fact that we know that widening participation students are very likely to have, you know, a number of those categories. So that's why we're here today, which is to start thinking about the ways in which all of those things that we already know about other groups might come together for widening participation students and how we can use it to support them. So, this is why you are here. There is, that we can, you know, from the discussions that we've had already, we know that there's lots of individual good practice. There's things happening at all different institutions. But we also know that widening participation strategies and even definitions, which we'll get onto in a bit, differ across institutions. And the point of this collaborative cluster is for us to try and create something that works across the sector. There are always going to be individual institutional needs, so it's not that we're trying to create something that's inflexible, but the idea that we could come up with a best practice set of guidelines that said, if you have this technology, this is how you can use it. So this is why you're here, so that we can do a bit of brainstorming and try and get everyone the best ideas and then come up with something that fits everyone. So, is it brainstorming? Is that
yes, brainstorming now, I think.
Yes. So what we're going to do for our first task is, until 11:30, it's a brainstorming activity. And what we'd like you to do is we want you to imagine your perfect world. Imagine there are no budgets. Imagine there are no academics being difficult. Imagine
all the systems work perfectly.
Yes, the technology does what you want it to do. I don't want to use the phrase blue sky thinking because I think Jill will throw something at me. But, you know, imagine that you can do whatever you wanted. Okay, that's what we're going to talk about for the next 25 minutes. If there was absolutely no barriers, how do you think this technology could be used in the best possible way to help widening participation students? And then we'll take that blue sky version and we'll turn it into something maybe a little bit more realistic. How does that sound? Yeah. So if we maybe jot down ideas on the post-its and then we can collect them and do something for sure with them.
We're going to be using our post-it notes as our record, basically.
So my name is, like I mentioned at the start, my name is Monica Anderson and I'm a Widening Participation Officer at the university, and I'm here with Victoria, who's the Sutton Trust Summer School Coordinator at the university, and we're really just going to give you kind of an overview of what we do in terms of widening participation at the University of Glasgow, how we use online resources and blended learning models within our WP programmes, focusing a little bit on our current use of lecture recording within those programmes, but also thinking about the future developments that we're doing and how lecture recording fits into that, but also the potential implementations, so kind of what we've just been doing, thinking about how we could use this to expand our WP provision. So just to kind of give you a bit of an overview, because like we already mentioned, WP at different institutions means different things. In terms of Glasgow, we are now moving away from what used to be a target school basis. So we used to work with schools who had lower progression rates to HE, but we're now expanding into target pupils basically within each schools. So our programmes are now expanding into all the secondary schools within the west of Scotland. So the targeting criteria that we have for our WP programmes are pupils who reside in MD20 or MD40 postcodes, those who are care experienced, those who are living without family support or estranged, refugees and asylum seekers, carers, but we also apply a school nomination system. So if a teacher, because we work very closely with the schools that we work with, if a teacher knows, for example, that someone doesn't meet any of this criteria, but there are extenuating circumstances which would make them a WP student, they can submit a nomination for that pupil to take part in our programmes. We also work with adult returners coming back to education through our access courses and also the SWAP programme. And we also have entrants from college who kind of fall within our WP remit. So we have a suite of pre-entry programmes that feed directly into our adjusted offers. So we can offer adjusted entry requirements to anybody who meets the criteria I just spoke about. But as part of that adjustment, they will have to complete one of our WP programmes. So just to give you a quick overview of our pre-entry programmes, we have our Reach and Access to a Career programme, which works with pupils who are interested in going into one of the kind of high demand professions. So dentistry, law, medicine, vet med, accountancy and finance, engineering and teaching. So we work with them from S4 through to S6. We have our Sutton Trust Summer School, which works with pupils in S5, but it's also the only programme that we have which targets pupils out with Scotland, so it's open to everybody, so it's open to our UK students as well. We have our Taster Weeks for S4 and S5 pupils in Glasgow City Council schools. We have our top-up programme, which works with S5 and S6 pupils, and it's really for anybody who's interested in going to kind of any general degree programme, not just kind of specific professions like Access or Reach programme does. And then we have our University of Glasgow Summer School, which again works with S5 and S6 pupils, but it's also mandatory for anybody who's coming into the university with a college qualification. So anybody coming in with an HNC or an HND, completion of our summer school will be part of their offer. It's also a transitional programme, so in the past we have had pupils take part in our summer school who have additional support needs, because basically through our summer school you are on campus for 4 weeks during the summer where you take part in 2 academic subjects plus an online study skills module. And during that time, you are essentially a student at Glasgow. You get a student card, you have access to the library, the sports facilities, you meet lecturers, you meet people who are going to be on your course when you come to Glasgow. So it basically gives pupils the opportunity to maybe get acquainted with the campus when it's a bit quieter and there's not as many people there, so you can see how that might be really beneficial to somebody with additional support needs. We also have our articulation programme, so we run a suite of bespoke articulation HNCs, which are standalone HNCs, but they lead into second year of several of our degrees. So basically, as part of the HNC, the pupils will spend usually about 1 day a week on campus. So it's basically a bit of a bridging programme of being in college, but also being within the university environment. Alongside the kind of pre-entry programmes that feed directly into our contextual admissions, we also have our early secondary programme, which focuses on S1 to S3 pupils, and it's basically run through workshops with entire cohorts, focusing on different career pathways, but also subject choices, so making sure that pupils are making the right subject choices at that early stage so that they can then progress onto the degree that they want to, and also focusing on all post-school destinations. So although we run the programme as the University of Glasgow, within that programme we focus on all destinations, including college routes, apprenticeships. So it's just basically making sure that pupils know that if this is what I want to become, this is the learner journey I'm going to have to take. And we also have our primary engagement programme, which works with P6 to P7 pupils, and it's a collaborative project that we have with Skills Development Scotland and Glasgow City Council. So far it's been run kind of in specific local authorities, but in January it will be rolled out nationally, so it will be available to all P6s and P7s across Scotland. So in terms of how we run our WP programmes, all of our programmes are really a mix of in-school sessions but also on-campus activity. And a key feature of any on-campus activity that we have includes that experience of being in a university lecture, because we recognise that that is probably the biggest difference between school and coming to university. It is that experience of being in a lecture and learning through that lecture style. And we also have online activities, so we use a lot of Adobe Connect sessions, we use Sway, the Microsoft Office package, and our online study skills module. So focusing on the kind of online resources and blended learning at Glasgow. So I mentioned Adobe Connect. We use Adobe Connect in a variety of ways. We use it as an alternative to in-school sessions. So as I mentioned, we work with schools across the whole of the west of Scotland, and we also work with some schools in the Western Isles. As you can imagine, all of our programs are delivered by WP tutors. We have a team of about 100 tutors who go out and deliver in-school sessions. If you are working with 2 pupils in Campbelltown, financially, it may not be the most reasonable idea to send 2 tutors out to work with 2 pupils. So we use Adobe Connect basically in that situation as an alternative to in-school sessions. We also use it as a complement to in-school activities. So for example, in Isla High School, we deliver the top-up programme by going out to the school twice. There is quite a bit of space between us going out between the 2 sessions, so we use Adobe Connect as a means of keeping in touch with the pupils so that it's not just a kind of we come in one day, we come the next day. It allows us to keep in touch with them during that time. And it can also be a part of on-campus activities. So again, if we have a pupil, for example, in the Western Isles and we have an on-campus activity, again, they may not be able to come to that session. So we have used Adobe Connect to allow them to basically come into the lecture and see what's happening on campus. We use Sway an awful lot, and this is something that we've started to use more and more in the last 12 months or so. And again, it can be a complement to in-school activities. So for example, this year, as part of our top-up programme, any pupil who's taking part in that, before they come to their first in-school session, they have to complete a Sway, which gives them an overview of what's involved in the programme, what expectations we have of them, what they're going to get out of it, but also we use Sway for them to be able to pick their question, because in top-up they can choose one of 5 questions, so they can do that using the Sway, which has saved a lot of time in the in-school sessions, because it means that when we're coming into schools we can directly go into their their subject-specific materials, rather than having to basically waste the first session going over introductions and getting everybody to pick their question. It's also an alternative to in-school sessions in case of absences. So if someone misses a school session or something's happened, they can basically use this way to catch up on the materials. And then kind of the biggest really kind of blended learning model that we use is for our online study skills module, which we host on Moodle, which is our virtual learning environment at Glasgow, and that is a part of several of our WP programmes, including the summer school, the S5 Taster Week, the Sutton Trust, and our HNC articulation programme. So I'll hand over to Victoria, who will tell you a little bit more about the online academic skills module.
Thank you. Cheers. Yeah, so as I mentioned at the beginning, I organise the Sutton Trust Summer School and also the Taster Weeks, and I also work very closely with the Summer School coordinator. So forgive me if this comes across a wee bit erratic, because part of the development, which I'll go into later, is happening at the moment, so we still haven't really worked out exactly where we're going with it. But currently, the online academic skills module has been developed to kind of help students identify maybe how they prefer to learn, to help them, to expose them to teaching methods that may differ from school and university. There's also videos there on how to use university facilities and services and the different services that are available to them. So it's a general sort of orientation about university life, not just at Glasgow, but in more general terms. It's currently delivered through a screencast, so maybe not the traditional lecture style, but it is a sort of a screencast with one of our tutors going through a prezi, and that's how the whole module is delivered. Students will access one video, they won't be able to go on to the next one until the previous has been watched. That's how we can ensure that they're actually watching it and not just skipping all the way through. Also, at the end of each of the sections, as it were, there is a sort of quiz based on all of the information that they will hopefully have been taking notes on previously, and we also have a reflective piece of writing that they'll do at the end of the online module, which will be based on perhaps the residential component of the programme that they've been on for Sutton Trust, or the on-campus component for the other programmes. The note-taking activity I want to mention specifically because it's, you know, part of the research that you'd put up about note-taking itself as a skill. That's one of the activities that we have in the module, which is actually based off of a lecture that's been recorded. I will say that it's the same lecture no matter which programme that you've been on. That also then means it's the same lecture no matter which academic stream that you might be studying on. So it's not maybe personalised in terms of what your academic interests are. It is time sensitive, as I mentioned, and it's actually part of a summative assessment for some of the programmes because completion of this module along with your attendance on some of these programmes is linked to the contextualised offers that we then go on to offer. Pre-entry activity, not quite sure exactly where I put it in there, I'll just put it onto the next slide. So as I mentioned, maybe one of the biggest changes that we're trying to implement just now, and it's probably been spurred on a little bit by the meeting that we had with yourself and the fact that this lecture capture technology is there to be used, and it's the development of subject-specific context. We did get that a lot from the feedback from students saying, well, I'm here to do medicine, so I don't really know why I'm listening to a lecture about history, that sort of thing. So we're trying to get academics on board and figure out when would be the best time to record these lectures and then how best to use it. Similarly, for some of these programmes, particularly the summer programmes, some students may complete them and then they've got a full year at school before they actually enter university. So it's trying to use this module or the lecture capture to develop, you know, a bank of lectures or some sort of materials that they can dip into and use throughout that year to continue this development of their academic skills. And yeah, I'll pass you on because you'll speak more about the WP students.
In terms of how we see lecture capture helping us with our WP provision, it's coming back to this idea of we spoke about earlier of, okay, we get the WP students onto campus, great, but do we actually facilitate them to be able to successfully complete their degree? So some of the issues that I've already mentioned today or we touched upon today, I'm the name point of contact at the University for Student Carers. As you can imagine, if you're a carer and you're balancing caring responsibilities with a full-time degree, attendance can be an issue. And while we have a flexible attendance policy in place for carers, if the lecture is not recorded or if the only thing you get are some very limited slides on your virtual learning environment, that's not really flexibility of attendance because you have no way of catching up on that lecture. So I've spoken to a lot of student carers who may be doing 3 subjects, and in one of them their lecture is absolutely fine and all the lectures are online, and that's great for them, but for another one it's not, and basically every time they miss a lecture they really struggle and they feel like they've fallen behind. So I think this is where lecture capture is going to be incredibly important. But even thinking about WP students, so the majority of our WP students commute to the university, some of them having quite a significant commute. I mean, we've got students coming down from Sanquhar, you know, so that is like an hour and a half on a train one way. And it's also quite an expensive route to take. So if you have one lecture on campus that day and it's costing you £20, £30 to get to campus, is it really worth it if you could just sit at home and then look over the lecture? Now, I know that some people say, well, attendance is part of coming to university, but we also have to accept the fact that our students are coming from diverse backgrounds. They're not all living in accommodation on campus. They're not all 5 minutes away. They can't just roll out of bed and come to the lecture in their pyjamas, okay? So I think this is an area where we are really looking at that provision of making sure that the WP students that are coming in, we're enabling them to succeed and giving them access to the materials in the best way that they can. One of the things that also came up is thinking about seminars. Now, I know this is specifically looking at lecture capture, but also thinking about seminars and taking part in seminars. So, for example, within our medicine degree, our medicine degree is based around PBLs, so problem-based learning, where you work with other students. Again, we've got carers who, we've given them flexibility for lectures, but they can't apply the same thing to a PBL. So if they miss their PBL, they've missed that whole week. And it is really difficult for them to catch up on that. So if there was a way for them to be able to capture that PBL discussion or contribute remotely, that would make it much easier for them to succeed. but also thinking about our programme expansion. So like I said, for some of our programmes we now work with over 160 secondary schools across the full breadth of the west of Scotland. So in some of these situations we might be working with one pupil in that school. Feasibly, it's not going to make sense for us to send a tutor to work with that one pupil. So if then we can use lecture capture to basically give them that experience, engage with them, that would be fantastic, because it would help us to expand those programmes to basically get in touch with all the WP students across the country, rather than basically what can happen at the moment is if you're local to the university, you're going to get loads of support. But if you live in somewhere in the middle of nowhere in Dumfries, you're not going to be engaged with as much. But also linking this idea of support. So if you are studying, for example, advanced hires, the fact that you could maybe access university level materials to aid in that transition again. So that is kind of where we feel that most of the developments could happen in terms of lecture capture and how it could help WP students at the pre-entry stage, but also once they're there so that they can support their success through their degree. Does anybody have any questions?
So Una and I are from Edinburgh University Students Association. I am the Vice President Education. She is Vice President Welfare. And Beth is there as well for us. So we're just here talking a little bit about the Students Association and what we are sort of doing around widening participation at the university. So, who are we? What are we? We are... Oh, yes. We had fun with our technology. The Students Association has 5 sabbatical officers which are elected each year. We have different remits, so welfare, education, activities and services, as well as community and our president. And we are a members organisation, we are for students, by students, and we do a huge range of things for campaigning, lobbying and advocates for lots of different things for all the students. We also do lots of events and I really don't know how to explain it. It's really everything. We are supporting students in everything. And our work also engages a lot with like quality processes, and we work a lot with university policy and now widening participation. So we're just going to talk a little bit about what we do. So a lot of our work sits in the Support to Succeed section that the widening participation strategy is. So the university's one, I don't remember, do you know the 4? There's 4 strands. Oh, sorry. Early engagement, support to get in, support to succeed, and to progress. And we've been working a lot on how we are supporting students while they are studying here. And so there are a few little campaigns that the sabbatical officers have taken a lead on this year that we're going to talk about a tiny bit. So the first one is a participation grant. And we do know that lack of funds can really prohibit working class students from engaging in additional activities while they are studying. And so the participation grant is sort of offered to break down these barriers that students do have for extracurricular activities, as well as sports clubs and societies. This was introduced in 2016 after we had a lot of research that suggested that WP students were less likely to be engaged and participate, and it was a pilot based off of something that happened in Sheffield. The grant is available to students on any sort of scholarship at the University of Edinburgh, and they can apply for up to £250 to £300, I believe? 250, sorry. Yeah, so they'll apply for that, and they just get the money, they can use it in whichever way they would like. It's usually to support memberships to clubs, societies, and things like that. So in the last academic year, we had about £25,000 that was given away as scholarships for any student that applied for it. Another thing that we are looking at this year is around hidden course costs, and this is work that I'm leading on a bit, and it's looking a lot about the hidden costs of education for students, particularly in courses that you wouldn't actually expect. So this is ranging from things from textbooks that they might have to pay for, to field trips, to materials for art courses. And we're just looking at all of these and making sure that students are aware of them when they apply, and also that they're able to prepare for these, or we get rid of them, ideally. So we're looking at this quite a bit, and there's just been some problems that popped up, but we're really trying to make sure that students are aware of these costs, or the university is making some steps to get rid of them. I am going to let Una talk a little bit about tackling elitism, because that's her part.
Hi. So the thing that I mentioned a little bit in my sort of introduction earlier is this student group that I have sort of convened since semester 1 started this year of students who, well, it's based on a sort of student group model that currently already runs at Oxford and Cambridge that's called Class Act, that you might have heard of, and it essentially is intended to sort of, as a kind of campaigning idea, acknowledge the reputation and experience of students at the University of Edinburgh as being elitist traditionally, and kind of therefore exclusive and not an inclusive place for people to kind of go to university, essentially. The model is a slight departure from the widening participation model in that the focus is, generally speaking, on sort of socioeconomic barriers to education sort of fairly solely. So the categories of student, it's purely self-identification, but the category of student that we're targeting is any student who is low income, who identifies as working class, who's the first generation in their family to go to university, but also who's care experienced or estranged. At Oxford and Cambridge, they also include in that mix state school students, but from sort of speaking to the student leaders who run those programmes there, they've definitely had the most problems with the inclusion of that kind of grouping in sort of attempting to run Class Act. So far, tackling elitism as a phrase has very much been used as like a campaign title. It's been the phrase that attracted quite a lot of students. We've got sort of like 20 to 30 sort of signed up that attracted students into the sort of topic area, and I think has had a lot of success in that, whilst maybe broad and difficult sometimes to explain exactly what it's sort of doing in more practical terms, has attracted a lot of people and given a sense to people from a very wide range of backgrounds that there is something that they can get involved in that will sort of improve their experience in some way. So far we've sort of been having like a few meetings to decide on a couple of key areas of focus. Those have primarily ended up being around 5 key themes. One of them I mentioned earlier, which is this idea of staff-student liaison or kind of community building, particularly for staff who themselves come from what we would now refer to as widening participation backgrounds, though they might not themselves have been WP students whilst they were at university. And there was a real sense from students that they value that linkage with staff who can in some way identify with their experience. Another one was about staff literacy. So I think in the same way that there's been a lot of emerging conversations about staff literacy around racism and racial microaggressions, there was a real sense there's a lot of sort of classist, if you will, microaggressions that undermine steadily over a course of many years the experience of widening participation and other sort of socioeconomically disadvantaged students whilst they're at university. There's then also the fairly obvious piece about funding, bursary and loan and maintenance grant kind of structures, which is clearly a larger and longer piece of work and one that currently doesn't have a set direction. But I think there's clearly an interest from the students who are there in looking at that as a topic area. Community outreach, the widening participation team at Edinburgh do already quite a really fantastic amount of community outreach through programmes like LEAPS, which is actually based in a building just over there. And I think there's a sense that that could be expanded a lot more, and there's definitely a willingness from students to do that and to get involved in it. But in particular, that there's a sense that it's not only about going and helping students who are in, SIMD 20 areas, for instance, come up into university and then support them whilst they're here through various mentoring programmes. It's also a sense that for the students who have arrived here and want to go and do that volunteering and do that community outreach, that it in some way is supportive to them in reconnecting with the communities that they come from, which was an interesting perspective that I hadn't really considered before when considering those sort of volunteering programmes. And then finally, peer support is a really key area for development. Again, something our widening participation team already does in some ways. There are peer mentoring programmes and also a staff mentoring programme for sort of different categories of widening participation student, but they are not fundamentally led by students who are also widening participation. So, for instance, the peer mentoring programme is students who have volunteered but are not necessarily WP themselves, mentoring younger students, which in many ways will be supporting those students, and I think has had really good results. But there was a sort of feeling among the group that there was some value in having contact with students very much like themselves who are further along in the sort of higher education process. So that's an area for development. I think the really interesting thing about what this work is doing, or what's happening in this work, is that it's slightly, it's kind of transcending the boundaries of what we thought student groups were meant to be already. The idea that you can sort of categorise student groups into sort of community activities, campaigning activities, advocacy, you know, kind of roles, or things that require connection with staff or staff input. And actually, what we're seeing is that for or what I think this indicates is that in particular for marginalised or more vulnerable groups of students, there's a real value in having all of those things together, especially in an institution as large as Edinburgh, where I think it's very easy to get lost in the masses, and that's definitely the feeling that's come across. I've kind of wittered on about literally just one of the bullet points, but I'm really hopeful that it's an area for significant development, both for us as a Students' Association in terms of how we format student activities and student opportunities, and also for building really strong linkages with our widening participation team, whether that's through sort of advocacy within the university, encouraging students themselves to be advocates where they feel able to do that, and also for building sort of supportive community structures that become embedded in the various different parts of the university overall. So that's tackling elitism. Thanks. Do you want to talk about accommodation, cost and tenancy rights, or
we can just skim over it, but it's very long.
Yeah, so basically our Vice President Community and also our President are doing some work on sort of cost of living. Well, cost of living is actually kind of a key priority for all of us as a team, and they're sort of focusing a lot on accommodation, cost and tenancy rights. And I think we were quite keen to include it because there's an important overlap, I think, with the slide that showed originally sort of what lecture capture has been used for in the past in terms of students who have caring responsibilities, the fact that essentially all of these different categories are more like, you're more likely to have a widening participation student in them, even though it's not addressed WP directly. So I think something like accommodation, cost and tenancy rights and linking those pieces of work really clearly to this group of students is something we're really keen to do, because it reinforces that message basically about sort of WP sometimes being something. It's sort of a theme that runs throughout, I think, a lot of our work, but isn't always explicitly identified. And essentially, we think it's important to explicitly identify it because they're a key group of our students and one that we want to support better. Where are we now? Yeah, this kind of like reiterates what I was talking about before, but sort of these are some of, I forgot about this slide. These are some of the other pieces of work that we do around student activity. And I think just from what I was sort of just saying there about the tackling elitism work, and I think also Steph's work on hidden course costs and sort of using, our various networks of student leaders to sort of tap into expanding that work and sort of improving that context, that bearing in mind all of the different sort of student opportunity structures and representation structures that we have is always really important, because a lot of the time, obviously we're going to say this, but the best change that you can make in a university environment where you're trying to make change for students is to actually really take a big lead from your student leaders that you have, because they have the experiential knowledge that is required to push these issues, basically. So that's kind of what that is. Thank you. Any questions?
Well done. Round of applause. You've all done that very well. Hello, folks. Thank you. That was such a lectury way of saying that. Thank you. I don't know why that is so universal. So we were talking before lunch. Your break activity was to think about what widening participation definitions kind of make sense to you. We have had conversations about how we define widening participation. I'm going to present to you just very quickly what we sort of thought out in our scoping would be a good way of looking at widening participation in this project. And you will all have little post-it notes on your table with your own definitions. If you have a different sort of definition, or if you have something that doesn't match what we think might be a good one, we really want to hear about it. So we were thinking of using, I'm going to butcher the way I say this name, Claes-Kulik et al.'s set of definitions from the university's strategies and approaches towards diversity, equality and inclusion, examples from across Europe, from the European Universities group. And that is to think about widening participation in terms of equality, diversity and inclusion. The way that they set it out is that diversity is the makeup of a group. So if we're thinking about this in scientific terms, the demographics of our sample, things like sex, gender, age, sexual orientation, cultural affiliations, religious affiliations, elements like that. So a diverse group is one which has many different categories within it. An inclusive group is one that is when actions are taken to ensure that diverse backgrounds are all being valued within that group. So you can have, for example, even people from Drumchapel's opinions will be listened to and considered. And then equality is recognising that some groups have unique or different barriers to entry of a group into a particular group, and that they may need some help to overcome those barriers in order to meaningfully participate. And I think that kind of addressed some of the discussions that we were having about tokenism and how sometimes it can feel like you might be the only working class person, for example, in a room. The thing that we liked about using these definitions is that we felt it included a lot of the different ways that we talk about widening participation. So in terms of widening participation, in terms of the deprivation indexes and the postcodes, because there are specific barriers that those people need some assistance overcoming in order to meaningfully participate in university life. We think that meaningfully participating in higher education is a really strong goal for all students. And so that works quite nicely with the widening participation agenda. And ensuring that all of the backgrounds are valued, the inclusivity aspect of it, we think creates a stronger learning community. So we quite liked this as a scaffold for moving forward in how we talk about widening participation in this cluster. And at this point, I just want to hear from you guys. Does that seem right? Or is anybody sitting there with a post-it note that they think isn't really included in this structure?
I think everything that you said, I hadn't put anything like that down, but there was just one word that I used that maybe isn't up there, and it's that the barriers are actually acknowledged.
Acknowledging the barriers.
For example,
thank you.
I think very recently estrangement has been sort of brought into the WP agenda and sort of the way we talk about it, and for a long time students who identified, well, maybe wouldn't even identify themselves as estranged because it wasn't, that word wasn't there or it wasn't acknowledged. So I think that's important as well.
Can I ask a really stupid question? What do we mean by estrangement?
Well, there again, so what do we mean by estrangement? I think the official definition is that you can't rely on the support of your family, whether it be financially or in terms of accommodation, anything like that. So it creates a lot of barriers for people who, okay, first of all, monetary. Secondly, if you don't have someone to even be a guarantor for accommodation, things like that, there's all different problems that can kind of raise. Although we have had estranged students who still have contact with family but don't have the support in the traditional manner of speaking.
Yeah, so I think it boils down to living without family support. So it's almost, there's a lot of similarities in the barriers that estranged students face, that care experienced students face, but it's almost doubled because they're not recognised by the local authorities. So they're not entitled to any of the supports that a care experienced student would have. Yeah, so it's acknowledging the barriers that maybe don't fit into one of the neat categories, something along those lines. Una, do you have a comment on that?
I say that I think that's a really good example of how institutions like individually have a lot of control over how they even interpret what I think is actually a really good sort of summary of this, because for instance estrangement has punitive definition according to funding bodies, like SAS and the SFE and things like that. And so I sit in this group called Edinburgh Cares, which is sort of run jointly by the Wellbeing Services and Widening Participation teams at the university, and they're sort of trying to divide, or we're trying to sort of devise an Edinburgh-specific definition of estrangement so that that support can be provided internally, but it becomes really difficult because of the interaction with funding bodies. So yeah, just that sort of that institutional kind of aspect to it, that acknowledgement has to both be kind of, I don't know, kind of cultural, but also like that.
Yeah, so it has to be a definition. For the purposes of this cluster, we need to have a definition that is flexible enough to allow institutions to take their own context into account as well. I think that's a really good point. Sorry, Peter.
So just to continue on with the estrangement, there's been a bit of work recently, and the SFC, the Scottish Funding Council, has a definition now, and it is a stakeholder group that I sit on and Dan Keane from Glasgow sit on, and the definition now is pretty broad, but there is a definition that universities can adopt in full or end. And I know SAS is looking at it as well, so it's kind of early stages, but it's moving really, really quickly forward. And just back to the initial point, I would add kind of equity to the context. So equality in terms of gaining access, we have equality in Scotland, but equity and meaningful, to kind of support meaningful participation is key as well. So that could be equity in terms of access to accommodation, access to funding, access to the lectures, in terms of virtual capture, but that equity should be the definition I would suggest.
Yeah. So it's sort of equity and equality are similar but not actually the same thing, and so we need to pull both of those in at the same time. I think that's a very good point. Yeah, Callum?
Just a comment really. I think at the moment we're talking quite a lot about meaningful participation, and on the kind of talking about definitions, one of the things that we're trying to establish at the UEA is what we mean by university done, and how does that affect meaningful participation, how do we assess that? So I think one of the words that comes to mind when thinking about widening participation is about the personalised nature of trying to overcome individual barriers, because as a commuter student in my first year, actually participation started and ended at my front door of my house when I left at 6:30 in the morning to get the parking ride to go to the university, and actually could potentially even bleed even further into how I access materials off campus, in the same way that if you are a student from an ethnic minority and you feel there's microaggressions going on in your accommodation, just because it's not on campus, because it's still university life, how do we meaningfully assess participation, how it affects all aspects of university life? And that's something I don't know whether lots of universities and institutions have really thought about, because it's quite a complex issue and actually quite a difficult thing to accept, that actually there's some things that as an institution that you can't necessarily control because they're outside of campus context, but it still doesn't mean that they don't contribute to what would be meaningful participation on campus, that they all have an effect and bleed into one another.
Yeah, so this definition also then needs to take into account, I think the word that we've been coming to a lot today about community, and how we're trying to create a community which has equal access for inclusive and diverse groups, equity of access for those groups, and we want that community to encompass that community to encompass not just what happens in this room, but also what happens when you walk outside of this room. But we recognise as well, as part of this collaborative cluster, that a lot of that is not necessarily something we can do, but we can at least try to set the expectations and model what that might look like. Does that summarise quite nicely what we were saying? Yeah.
Just to continue on Callum's point, there is a whole debate why participation is equity of access or equity of outcome. So does everyone graduate with a first class degree? And that's where university life, your experiences can help shape that. So having maybe bookending it as an access or opportunity or outcome, that should be involved, because that's essentially the university life experience will dictate.
Yeah, so equity of access and equity of outcomes. I'm repeating everything that everyone's saying because I'm not 100% sure how much this mic's going to catch of this discussion. And I just think this is a really nice thing to have recorded. Sorry, you had a...
Well, just to back up that, we have lots of emphasis is on the access, on that kind of getting in. So maybe a little bit more, I mean, participate's there, but maybe a bit more emphasis of continuing that all the way through the degree or qualifications there.
Yeah.
And that needs to be in there, that bullet point needs to be emphasised.
Yeah, so the meaningfully participating is about meaningfully participating in lots of different contexts, some of which might be quite individual, some of which are maybe more community focused.
And throughout a course?
And throughout
not just the academic side.
Throughout a programme of study, possibly even beyond a programme of study. I mean, that also takes into account graduate attributes, doesn't it? In the sort of, you know, if you are a graduate of whatever university, then you have these skills, you have the ability to recognise how equity of access might affect things.
And even things like people having enough money to actually graduate, go to the graduate.
Oh gosh, yeah, yeah,
yeah.
Yeah, pay your library fines and all that. Yeah. Okay, so we are now going to talk about the future planning part of this. So like we said at the start, this is really just a hub to get you all together, and the idea is that the whole sector is going to go away and do more work. Basically, we are going to set you some homework, but we have some homework as well. We have a couple of questions that we would like you to consider for the next sort of 50 minutes, and then we're going to bring it all together, summarise what we think we as a cluster have decided we're going to do, particularly for moving towards our next meeting, which I've forgotten the date of it, that's dreadful. The 3rd of April in Aberdeen, where we would like to see some of you, probably not be able to see all of you, but we would really like to see it have some consistency. But what we need to do is set up that room in Aberdeen on the 3rd of April with the tools that they're going to need to do the next part of the work. So our questions are really, what do we know? Where do we see good practice? Where are the holes in our evidence? Where are we getting our evidence from? And what kind of evidence do we have? We have some other questions that we've kind of been thinking on the back of some of the discussions we've been having today. And we're going to set this up as a big discussion group. I'm just going to pause the recording now so that we can start discussing